Well, good morning everybody. Another impromptu video. Today, this has got a number of purposes, let's say. For my new members of the Seniors Card group on Facebook, greetings and thank you for joining. Well, there's a number of things that come to mind, and I have no doubt that some of you would have thought about this and had travel plans, let's say, put on hold because of this COVID-19, as they call it. The way I'm looking at it is I'd like to get in touch with Queensland Rail within literally the next couple of days. First of all, see whether I can make a booking for October. That's number one. Are they booking? With the proviso, of course, it may have to be pushed back by a month or two. Who knows? This is the sort of thing we don't know. But I do know one thing. If I use this year's passes up, which I intend to do, with like two passes equals first class, by the way, you get 4 passes a year. So I want to do a return trip out to Longreach and to Winton. Because I haven't been to Winton since the 1970s when they used to run passenger trains out there. Now that's one of the things. We use the passes. And I think that may be possible. In other words, to book that some months in advance, it's quite possible that the travel restrictions will be off and we'll be able to, roam around, shall we say, and take photos and enjoy trips and what have you. What comes to mind also, I was watching the Insiders program, which I hope to provide a link to, which I know that many of my friends will say, it's all leftist propaganda. Well, it's not entirely leftist propaganda. I'd say that it's a general overview of things that are going on in politically or in news and things that are happening around us in relation to, right now it seems to be in relation to this COVID-19 and what restrictions there are and what's happening and so forth. But they're also doing things that a lot of people looking at it would hardly believe, and the commentators even said this, and by the way, if you get 4 commentators you might get 3 leftists and 1 conservative if you're lucky. But irrespective of that, even the Prime Minister's saying, well, there's no blue team here, there's no red team, there's no it's not just the government, it's not the unions, it's everybody. We're all Australians, we've got to work towards a conclusion of all this, and that's fine. And they basically have nationalised the private health, the hospitals and so on, which leaves you with a few questions for how they're going to unnationalise them, but I suppose that part they can do. But there is talk, if we're discussing transport, they're not giving a lifeline to Virgin, which I'm glad they're not, frankly. Because then they'd have to give a lifeline to Qantas and Jetstar and wherever else. They'd never finish. What I believe will happen, and I'm not trying to be funny about this or some sort of prophet, but I believe this, that the travel will be extremely low right now as it is. People are not permitted to fly all around the place. The borders are closed and all the rest of it. Only essential travellers at the moment, and that includes what they call FIFO, fly in, fly out. But even they are going to be restricted in the coming days. But when it does become more or less back to normal, I would predict, as many other commentators on television and so on have already predicted, even today, it'll never return to normal, as in all the companies coming back into operation and running everything again as it was prior to COVID-19. That's just not going to happen. Many of them will close and some will come back because they've got this payment now, $1,500 a fortnight for laid off workers. These are not sacked people. So that's stopped the run on the Centrelink, largely. They will come back into operation, but later on, if they find themselves scaled back, that's up to them. They'll have to remove quite a number of people, unfortunately. But getting on, as I said, to transport, I believe this, that it's not past the government, even though it's a Conservative or a coalition government. That to my American friends, it'd be more like the Republicans, by the way, and to my British friends, it'd be like a Conservative Party, although it's not entirely Conservative. The coalition is made up of the Liberal Party. We call it Liberal here, which is opposite to the American term, by the way. And the National Party, which used to be the Old Country Party. Now, their leanings are a little bit more to the right than the government's, like in the centre, or a little bit right of centre. But they're finding themselves doing things. I believe they might nationalise the airlines. They might nationalise the bus services, long distance, and then eventually sell those back, or sell those on, shall I say, to people who would like to have an opportunity to start running a service. But now I'll make it, shall I say, quite an early prediction on some of this. They're talking about, oh, that we need competition and so on. Yeah, well, you might say that. And so a government airline based on taking over Virgin is competition in a sense to Qantas. But discount airfares, really cheap airfares, like the one I tried to get, which was $61 from Brisbane to Sydney on Jetstar, and I never even attempted to get my money back. I had to go down by train to be there the day before, otherwise I couldn't have made the appointment that I had in Sydney. Now, those sort of discount fares, anyway, are over and done. They're finished for the foreseeable future. Which means that the railways, in my opinion, might have a resurgence in travel. First of all, your half fare, the people who ignore the trains right now, and they might be entitled to half fare, they just, well, you know, they get half fare in a sense by flying. Well, those sort of fares are over, and now it'll be a case of, oh, you want to go Brisbane to Melbourne? No problems, that's $300. You go, what? It's $300, you know? And that's just figure out of the air, let's say, but it'd be like that. Oh well, I'll sit up, you know, on the train for a couple of days and get there. And by the way, not just sit up. In my case, for the $300, round figures, I could get a sleeping car down to Sydney and then from Sydney to Melbourne. In other words, I'd get on these days. You've got to get on at casino and you go to Sydney. And that night you go off to Melbourne. So I don't see that as a big problem, but people might suddenly wake up to this train travel and might demand more and more sleeping cars. Well, where are they going to get them from? I'd say they've got them waiting for them, sitting there. Some of them are refurbished, and the whole trains are refurbished. That's the Southern Aurora. Anyone is in my age group would remember the Southern Aurora. It was my favourite train. I rode it 10 times one year from Melbourne to Sydney. It'll come back, and there are plenty of cars in storage in Adelaide for the Great Southern Railway, or what they call themselves these days, Beyond Travel, or I call them Beyond Belief or Beyond Blue. But they're in storage. They'll be able to use those on Sydney Melbourne, Sydney Brisbane, and they'll increase and probably nationalise that company and have the fares drop in half. Because they're still subsidised, but they'd be running at a more reasonable rate and people would be able to afford it, and pensioners and seniors would at last be able to travel Sydney to Perth and Adelaide up to Darwin and so on. That's just my dream or my hope that would happen. But I'm getting ahead of it all happening. If people look back and say, oh gee, he talked about that a few months ago. Well, I think it'll happen. And all of a sudden, the trains will be increased in number, in size, and in frequency, and all the rest of it. You won't have a once-a-week service to Perth. You're more likely to have it 3 times a week. Up to Darwin, at least twice a week, maybe more. I mean, there's enough equipment around. If you don't do a tour, and that is what it is today, Darwin, and you go down to Katherine, you spend hours going to Katherine Gorge. Then you get to Alice Springs, you spend hours looking around at something at Alice Springs, and etc., etc. If you just get to Darwin, and if you say 3-4 hours later, you come back, you can do 3 services a week, not twice, for sure. And therefore, you look at it that way, 4 times if you had 2 sets. So don't think that there's no trains. So anyway, I just say, look for a totally different rail and bus and airline service after the COVID-19 is over. And I use that, if you like, as a discussion point on our group or anywhere else, or on YouTube or Facebook or anywhere that this video is going. So thank you for viewing.